Hello, this is Morel Bernard with the continuation of the story Secret Adversary. Last words were that Tuppence narrated her adventures with some complacence. Julius occasionally interjected an admiring bully. Sir James said nothing until she had finished, when his quiet, "Well done, Miss Tuppence," made her flush with pleasure. And by the way, please subscribe to the channel. And please share the video. Share the story. Thank you. I will proceed. "There's one thing I don't get clearly," said Julius. "What put her up to clearing out?" "I don't know," confessed Tuppence. Sir James stroked his chin thoughtfully. The room was in great disorder. That looks as though her flight was unpremeditated, almost as though she had got a sudden warning to go from someone. "Mr. Brown, I suppose," said Julius scoffingly. The lawyer looked at him deliberately for a minute or two. "Why not?" he said. "Remember, you yourself have once been worsted by him." Julius flushed with vexation. "I feel just mad when I think of how I handed out Jane's photograph to him like a lamb. Gee, if I ever lay hands on it again, I'll freeze on it like hell." "That contingency is likely to be a remote one," said the other dryly. "I guess you're right," said Julius frankly. "And in any case, it's the original I'm out after. Where do you think she can be, Sir James?" The lawyer shook his head. "Impossible to say. But I've a very good idea where she has been." "You have? Where?" Sir James smiled. "At the scene of your nocturnal adventures. The Bournemouth nursing home." "There? Impossible. I asked." "No, my dear sir. You asked if anyone of the name of Jane Finn had been there. Now, if the girl had been placed there, it would almost certainly be under an assumed name." "Bully for you," cried Julius. "I never thought of that." "It was fairly obvious," said the other. "Perhaps the doctor's in it too," suggested Tuppence. Julius shook his head. "I don't think so. I took to him at once. No, I'm pretty sure Dr. Hall's all right." "Hall, did you say?" asked Sir James. "That is curious. Really very curious." "Why?" demanded Tuppence. "Because I happened to meet him this morning. I've known him slightly on and off for some years, and this morning I ran across him in the street. Staying at the Metropole, he told me." He turned to Julius. "Didn't he tell you he was coming up to town?" Julius shook his head. "Curious," mused Sir James. "You did not mention his name this afternoon, or I would have suggested your going to find him for further information with my card of introduction." "I guess I might," said Julius with unusual humility. "I ought to have thought of the false name stunt." "How could you think of anything after falling out of that tree?" cried Tuppence. "I'm sure anyone else would have been killed right off." "Well, I guess it doesn't matter now anyway," said Julius. "We've got Mrs. Vandermeyer on a string, and that's all we need." "Yes," said Tuppence, but there was a lack of assurance in her voice. A silence settled down over the party. Little By little, the magic of the night began to gain a hold on them. There were sudden creaks of the furniture, imperceptible rustlings in the curtains. Suddenly Tuppence sprang up with a cry. "I can't help it. I know Mr. Brown somewhere in the flat. I can feel him." "Ah, sure, Tuppence. How could he be? This door's open into the hall. No one could have come in by the front door without our seeing and hearing him. I can't help it. I feel he's here." She looked appealingly at Sir James, who replied gravely, "With due deference to your feelings, Miss Tuppence, and mine as well as for that matter, I do not see how it is humanly possible for anyone to be in the flat without our knowledge." The girl was a little comforted by his words. "Sitting up at night is always rather jumpy," she confessed. "Yes," said Sir James. "We are in the condition of people holding a séance. Perhaps if a medium were present, we might get some marvellous results." "Do you believe in spiritualism?" asked Tuppence, opening her eyes wide. The lawyer shrugged his shoulders. "There is some truth in it, without a doubt, but most of the testimony would not pass muster in the witness box." The hours drew on, with the first faint glimmerings of dawn. Sir James drew aside the curtains. They beheld what few Londoners see, the slow rising of the sun over the sleeping city. Somehow, with the coming of the light, the dreads and fancies of the past night seemed absurd. Tuppence's spirits revived to the normal. "Hurrah," she said. "It's going to be a gorgeous day. And we shall find Tommy and Jane Finn, and everything will be lovely. I shall ask Mr. Carter if I can't be made a dame." At 7 o'clock, Tuppence volunteered to go and make some tea. She returned with a tray containing the teapot and 4 cups. "Who's the other cup for?" inquired Julius. "The prisoner, of course. I suppose we might call her that." "Taking her tea seems a kind of anticlimax to last night," said Julius thoughtfully. "Yes, it does," admitted Tuppence. "But anyway, here goes. Perhaps you'd both come too in case she springs on me or anything. You see, we don't know what mood she'll wake up in." Sir James and Julius accompanied her to the door. "Where's the key?" "Oh, of course, I've got it myself." She put it in the lock and turned it, then paused. "Supposing, after all, she's escaped," she murmured in a whisper. "Plump impossible," replied Julius reassuringly. But Sir James said nothing. Tuppence drew a long breath and entered. She heaved a sigh of relief as she saw that Mrs. Vandermeyer was lying on the bed. "Good morning," she remarked cheerfully. "I've brought you some tea." Mrs. Vandermeyer did not reply. Tuppence put down the cup on the table by the bed and went across to draw up the blinds. When she turned, Mrs. Vandermeyer still lay without a movement. With a sudden fear clutching at her heart, Tuppence ran to the bed. The hand she lifted was cold as ice. Mrs. Vandermeyer would never speak now. Her cry brought the others. A very few minutes sufficed. Mrs. Vandermeyer was dead. Must have been dead some hours. She had evidently died in her sleep. "If that isn't the cruelest luck," cried Julius in despair. The lawyer was calmer, but there was a curious gleam in his eyes. "If it is luck," he replied. "You don't think, but say that's plumb impossible? No one could have got in?" "No," admitted the lawyer. "I don't see how they could. And yet, she's on the point of betraying Mr. Brown, and she dies. Is it only chance? But how? Yes, how? That is what we must find out." He stood there silently, gently stroking his chin. "We must find out," he said quietly. And Tuppence felt that if she was Mr. Brown, she would not like the tone of those simple words. Julia's glance went to the window. "The window's open," he remarked. "Do you think—" Tuppence shook her head. "The balcony only goes along as far as the boudoir. We were there." "He might have slipped out," suggested Julius. But Sir James interrupted him. "Mr. Brown's methods are not so crude. In the meantime, we must send for a doctor. But before we do so, is there anything in this room that might be of value to us?" Hastily, the three searched. A charred mass in the grate indicated that Mrs. Vandermeyer had been burning papers on the eve of her flight. Nothing of importance remained, though they searched the other rooms as well. "There's that," said Tuppence suddenly, pointing to a small, old-fashioned safe let into the wall. "It's for jewellery, I believe, but there might be something else in it." The key was in the lock, and Julius swung open the door and searched inside. He was some time over the task. "Well?" said Tuppence impatiently. There was a pause before Julius answered. Then he withdrew his head and shut to the door. "Nothing," he said. In 5 minutes, a brisk young doctor arrived, hastily summoned. He was deferential to Sir James, whom he recognised. "Heart failure, or possibly an overdose of some sleeping draught," he sniffed. "Rather an odour of chloral in the air." Tuppence remembered the glass she had upset. A new thought drove her to the washstand. She found the little bottle from which Mrs. Vandermeyer had poured a few drops. It had been 3 parts full. Now it was empty. Nothing was more surprising and bewildering to Tuppence than the ease and simplicity with which everything was arranged, owing to Sir James' skilful handling. The doctor accepted quite readily the theory that Mrs. Vandermeyer had accidentally taken an overdose of chloral. He doubted whether an inquest would be necessary. If so, he would let Sir James know. He understood that Mrs. Vandermeyer was on the eve of departure for abroad, and that the servants had already left. Sir James and his young friends had been paying a call upon her when she was suddenly stricken down, and they had spent the night in the flat, not liking to leave her alone. Did they know of any relatives? They did not. But Sir James referred him to Mrs. Vandermeyer's solicitor. Shortly afterwards, a nurse arrived to take charge, and the others left the ill-owned building. "And what now?" asked Julius, with a gesture of despair. "I guess we're down and out for good." Sir James stroked his chin thoughtfully. "No," he said quietly. "There is still the chance that Dr. Hall may be able to tell us something." "Gee, I've forgotten him." "The chance is slight, but it must not be neglected. I think I told you that he is staying at the Metropole. I should suggest that we call upon him there as soon as possible. Shall we say after a bath and breakfast? It was arranged that Tuppence and Julius should return to the Ritz and call for Sir James in the car. This programme was faithfully carried out, and a little after 11 they drew up before the Metropole. They asked for Dr. Hall, and a page boy went in search of him. In a few minutes the little doctor came hurrying towards them. "Can you spare us a few minutes, Dr. Hall?" said Sir James pleasantly. "Let me introduce you to Miss Cowley, Mr. Hershmeyer. I think you already know." A quizzical gleam came into the doctor's eye as he shook hands with Julius. "Ah, yes, my young friend of the tree episode. Ankle all right, eh? I guess it's cured owing to your skillful treatment, Doc. And the heart trouble? Uh-huh. Still searching," said Julius briefly. "To come to the point, can we have a word with you in private?" asked Sir James. "Certainly. I think there's a room here where we shall be quite undisturbed." He led the way and the others followed him. They sat down and the doctor looked inquiringly at Sir James. "Dr. Hall, I'm very anxious to find a certain young lady for the purpose of obtaining a statement from her. I have reason to believe that she has been at one time or another in your establishment at Bournemouth. I hope I am transgressing no professional etiquette in questioning you on the subject. I suppose it is a matter of testimony." Sir James hesitated a moment, then he replied, "Yes." "I shall be pleased to give you any information in my power. What is the young lady's name?" Mr. Hershmeyer asked me, I remember. He half turned to Julius. "The name," said Sir James bluntly, "is really immaterial. She would be almost certainly sent to you under an assumed one, but I should like to know if you are acquainted with a Mrs. Vandermeyer." "Mrs. Vandermeyer of 20 South Audley Mansions. I know her slightly." "You are not aware of what has happened?" "What do you mean?" "You do not know that Mrs. Vandermeyer is dead?" "Dear, dear. I had no idea of it. When did it happen?" "She took an overdose of coral last night. Purposefully. Accidentally, it is believed. I should not like to say myself. Anyway, she was found dead this morning. Very sad. A singularly handsome woman. I presume she was a friend of yours, since you are acquainted with all these details." "I am acquainted with the details because, well, it was I who found her dead." "Indeed," said the doctor, starting. "Yes," said Sir James, and stroked his chin reflectively. "This is very sad news. But you will excuse me if I say that I do not see how it bears on the subject of your inquiry." "Well, it bears on it in this way. It is not a fact that Mrs. Vandermeyer committed a young relative of hers to your charge." Julius leaned forward eagerly. "That is the case," said the doctor quietly. "Under the name of Janet Vandermeyer. I understood her to be a niece of Mrs. Vandermeyer's." "And she came to you?" "As far as I can remember, in June or July of 1915. Was she a mental case?" "Well, she's perfectly sane, if that's what you mean. I understood from Mrs. Vandermeyer that the girl had been with her on the Lusitania when that ill-fated ship was sunk and had suffered a severe shock in the consequence. We're on the right track, I think. Sir James looked round. As I said before, I'm a mutt, returned Julius. The doctor looked at him, at them all, curiously. You spoke of wanting a statement from her, he said. Supposing she is not able to give one. What? You have just said that she's perfectly sane. Well, so she is. Nevertheless, if you want a statement from her concerning any events prior to May 7, 1915, she will not be able to give it to you. They looked at the little man, stupefied. He nodded cheerfully. It's a pity, he said, a great pity, especially as I gather, Sir James, that the matter is important. But there it is. She can tell you nothing. But why, man? Darn it all, why? The little man shifted his benevolent glance to the excited young American. Because Janet Vandermeyer is suffering from a complete loss of memory. What? Quite so. An interesting case. A very interesting case. Not so uncommon, really, as you would think. There are several very well-known parallels. It's the first case of the kind that I've had under my own personal observation, and I must admit that I found it of absorbing interest. There was something rather ghoulish in the little man's satisfaction. And she remembers nothing, said Sir James slowly. Nothing prior to May 7, 1915. After that date, her memory is as good as yours or mine. And the first thing she remembers is landing with the survivors. Everything before that is a blank. She did not know her own name, or where she had come from, or where she was. She couldn't even speak her own tongue. But surely all this is most unusual, put in Julius. No, my dear sir. Quite normal, under the circumstances. Severe shock to the nervous system. Loss of memory proceeds nearly always on the same lines. I suggested a specialist, of course. There's a very good man in Paris. Makes a study of these cases. But Mrs. Vandermeyer opposed the idea of publicity that might result from such a course. I can imagine she would, said Sir James grimly. I fell in with her views. There is a certain notoriety given to these cases. And the girl was very young, 19, I believe. It seemed a pity that her infirmity should be talked about, might damage her prospects. Besides, there is no special treatment to pursue in such cases. It is really a matter of waiting. Waiting? Yes. Sooner or later, the memory will return, as suddenly as it went. But in all probability, the girl will have entirely forgotten the intervening period and will take up life where she left off, at the sinking of the Lusitania. And when do you expect this to happen? The doctor shrugged his shoulders. Ah, that I cannot say. Sometimes it is a matter of months. Sometimes it has been known to be as long as 20 years. Sometimes another shock does the trick. One restores what the other took away. Another shock, eh? Said Julius thoughtfully. Exactly. There was a case in Colorado. The little man's voice trailed on, voluble, mildly enthusiastic. Julius did not seem to be listening. He had relapsed into his own thoughts and was frowning. Suddenly he came out of his brown study and hit the table such a resounding bang with his fist that everyone jumped. The doctor most of all. "I've got it, I guess, Doc. I'd like your medical opinion on the plan I'm about to outline. Say Jane was to cross the herring pond again, and the same thing was to happen. The submarine, the sinking ship, everyone to take to the boats, and so on. Wouldn't that do the trick? Wouldn't it give a mighty big bump to her subconscious self, or whatever the jargon is, and start it functioning again right away?" A very interesting speculation, Mr. Hershmeyer. In my opinion, it would be successful. It is unfortunate that there is no chance of the conditions repeating themselves, as you suggest. Why not join me? Join me for the next video, the next part of the story of Secret Adversary. Join me for the next part of the story, the next video of Secret Adversary with me, Morel. I'll see you then. Bye.